You may go first.
Good evening, Chairman Craven and committee members.
Do you have your little button up? Whichever position it seems to be higher.
It is on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's good, thanks.
My name is Melissa Jenkins. I'm a neuropsychologist and a member of the clinical faculty at Brown University. I've conducted research on attention and memory processing in rape survivors with post-traumatic stress disorder, and I've evaluated, treated, and testified as an expert witness on behalf of many patients over the last 25 years. Different types of trauma produce the same core symptoms and neurophysiological consequences of PTSD. Traumas that produce PTSD include military combat, genocide, terrorism, natural disasters, sexual assaults, and other crimes. Military combat and sexual assault are the two most frequent causes of PTSD in the United States. Symptoms of PTSD can be lifelong and include re-experiencing the traumatic event, avoiding reminders of the event, physiological hyperreactivity, and abnormalities in cognitive processing, including attention and memory. I know you've already heard a lot about sexual assault tonight, but I'd like to leave three main impressions with you. The first is that very few traumatic experiences are associated with more self-blame than childhood sexual assault. No matter how irrational this sounds to adults and professionals, as we think about the innocence of the children in our lives and their inability to comprehend or consent in that situation, virtually every survivor's story that I've ever heard contains some tinges of self-blame. It's one reason that these stories can take longer than other traumas to surface. They're told not to tell. It's our little secret. You'll get in trouble. Nobody will believe you. Children don't want to alarm or disappoint their parents, especially if their family situation is already troubled or unstable in any way. Especially if family members are the abusers or have a relationship with the abusers, which is more than 90% of the time. It's rarely a stranger, and children receive many explicit and implicit messages not to tell. It's very hard to overcome those messages. About 73% of child victims don't tell anyone about the abuse for at least a year. And 45% of victims don't tell anyone for at least 5 years. Some never disclose. The hardest part is telling. It takes time, it takes maturity, it takes a place of safety and security, often outside the family home. It takes having a trusted confidant, somebody to tell. It takes stability and confidence to deal with the emotional fallout, and not everyone ever gets to that point. I admire the courage of all the survivors who have spoken out tonight. There are people who have experienced childhood sexual abuse who will never be able to talk about it. That's why this bill is so important. It gives people time and the chance to speak out when they can, if they can. The other thing, the second point that I'd like to make is the question that I'm asked most frequently about memory and post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm asked whether patients can remember the details of traumatic events even when they've occurred many years before. There are studies that show that eyewitness accounts of all crimes are faulty. In the Bill Cosby case, which occurred recently, his defense raised a motion that accusers should undergo hearings to assess the competency of their memories after an expert attested that memories are corruptible and vulnerable to suggestion. Asked to opine on this matter, I told a reporter that competency evaluations would shed little light on that type of autobiographical memory. Judges and juries assess credibility by the consistency of the accuser's report, the presence of objective information that verifies that report, such as DNA, eyewitnesses, other objective data, as well as their own subjective assessment of the credibility of that individual. There's not a perfect solution, so we trust the convergence of data, multiple witnesses reporting the same thing, subjective reports that line up with objective evidence as the best solution. So that motion was struck down in the Cosby case. The court ruled that cross-examination, allowing the judge and jury to assess the totality of the evidence, was the best procedure. So despite memory's imperfections, courts generally presume competency rather than the opposite. False allegations of rape are exceedingly rare, on the order of 1%. As memories go, traumatic memories are encoded in an especially indelible way. It's easy to forget an item or two from your grocery list, but it's very hard to forget where you were on 9/11 when you heard that a plane had struck a tower. You remember where you were. So I think similar are memories of sexual assault that occur in childhood. In objective studies, we do find small inefficiencies in encoding and retrieval for new non-trauma relevant memory. But we don't find any unusual erosion of autobiographical or traumatic memory. Those memories may be buried, they may be compartmentalized, or they may be suppressed. But I can assure you the memories you've heard about tonight are encoded with the same indelible ink as your own hearing about 9/11 some 18 years ago. You remember that day clearly, and survivors remember what happened to them. Courts don't just take a witness's word for it also. They evaluate the consistency of the report and the other evidence that backs it up, and only find guilt where it really exists. So the persistence of traumatic memories is very strong. It's unfortunately strong for survivors, and it does allow them to accurately relay their truth many years after the fact. So there is no reason not to extend the statute of limitations based on their ability to recall what's happened to them. The third point that I'd like to make briefly, but importantly, the one adage that I've heard from many, many survivors over the years is that seeing any measure of justice for their sexual assault has done more to improve their outlook, their functioning, their trust in humanity than any amount of mental health treatment. Justice is the best therapy. In this manner, you have the power to help survivors more than I possibly could. Help them to find some measure of justice by holding their abusers accountable. Make them visible and unable to abuse more children. Let survivors have the time that they need to seek justice. Thank you.